Per tant, permeteu-me que comenci en català i després passem a l'anglès perquè els ponents ens entenguin, sobretot. Moltes gràcies per venir a l'esdeveniment obert d'aquesta sèrie de trobades privades i amb polítics, amb policy makers, que tindrem demà i demà passat a Brussel·les, però volíem aprofitar que estàvem aquí a Barcelona només per estar darrere una porta tancada parlant entre nosaltres. Volíem també compartir amb la societat i amb tothom que ens segueix per l'streaming el que està sortint d'aquesta primera trobada internacional d'auditors algorítmics. I ara sí, passo a l'anglès, si em permeteu. Thank you all for being here. Thank you to the speakers and the members of this meeting. It is a pleasure for me to have a public space to share with others what we've been working on today, in the last few weeks, and we're going to be working on tomorrow and the day after in Brussels with policymakers around algorithmic auditing. If you've followed me in my public appearances, I often say that algorithmic auditing is like the seatbelt of AI. And I am convinced that AI needs seatbelts. We have lots of technology around us making more and more sensitive decisions about our lives without any kind of control or oversight mechanisms. We have algorithms and AI systems that are deciding whether we get a mortgage or a loan, whether we access university, whether we get medical treatment. Lots of really serious decisions that oftentimes are not being made in ways that are fair, explainable, transparent or accountable. And there's a need to make sure that just in the same way that we ensured that cars were better by being safer, that we also come up with the instruments that will allow us to make AI better and safer through specific mechanisms like algorithmic auditing. So for me, in the same way, seatbelts are the consequence of a social debate around how to build safety into automobiles. Algorithmic auditing should be one of the specific mechanisms that allow us to ensure that AI serves us all in ways that are fair and transparent. And so after working on this for a long time, at Eticas we have been auditing for the last 5 years. We have 20 audits that we're going to be doing in the next year. So there's going to be a big pick in our activity around audits. The same is happening with other organizations. And we felt it was high time for us all to get together and discuss what algorithmic auditing means and whether it is the tool that will allow us to ensure that AI has seatbelts, that AI creates mechanisms to protect us when we are using it or when our data is being used to build those systems. So the goal of this meeting is to get together different people from lots of different places that have been working specifically on auditing these systems, trying to see what we can learn from one another and whether we can go out to the public and policymakers and the industry and say, we think that this protects people. We think that this methodology, this auditing process ensures that AI is better, that AI is safer, that AI protects people. And so the idea now today is to share with you what we have done, the things that we have learned in this journey of auditing others, and where we think that the field may go in the next few months and years. We're having this meeting now because the interest in AI auditing has gone up massively in the last few months. I've always told my team at Eticas that our time would come, and I really feel that our time has come. Like after talking about the need for auditing and for better standards and for better technologies and for a better assessment of the social impact of technology for a long, long time, Eticas has existed for 10 years. Finally, the interest around how to make AI and technical systems better seems to be there in ways that are meaningful. The challenge is, how do we go from principles to practices? How do we go from recognizing that we want AI to be fair, to not discriminate, to be transparent, to defining what that means in practice? In the same way that with the car example, policymakers decided that cars had to be safe, and the industry came up with seatbelts. So the policymakers have defined what we want out of AI. We want AI that works for people in fair ways. We want AI that is transparent. We want AI that uses personal data with consent. The principles are already there. The challenge is, how do those principles translate into specific mechanisms that ensure that rights are protected in technology processes? Our contention is that AI auditing allows for this. Not only AI auditing, there's lots of other tools that can be developed, but AI auditing is at the heart of the effort to ensure that the principles we have developed around AI are translated into specific practices that mean that the technologies that make decisions about our life are actually go through a process of ensuring that those decisions are fair, acceptable, and transparent. So that's what we've been discussing this morning, what we're going to continue to discuss. And without much further ado, I want to introduce the panel and ask them a few questions. I'm going to introduce them from right to left. On my far right, only physically, is Jenny Brennan from the Ada Lovelace Institute, an organization that we very much look up to, just like everyone here comes from organizations that we very much look up to, that has been leading the way in thinking about the policy implications of everything around data and AI. After her, it's Shay Brown, the CEO and founder of Babel AI, which is one of the organizations like Eticas that is engaged in actually auditing algorithms from the perspective of a service provider. So trying to help companies comply and understand risk through providing these algorithmic audits. So it's just great to see that there's more people out there doing similar things, and that we look alike in we look at things very, very similarly. Then we have Jennifer Kopp from the University of Cambridge. Interestingly, a lot of the people that are saying the most relevant and interesting things around AI accountability are academics. So academia is playing a really meaningful role in this space. So we have quite a few academics at the panel today. Divish Roshi, an academic from University College London, with more of a perspective coming from the law, from a legal point of view. Then after me on my left, Lofred Matzu from Truera, another one of the organizations that, like Eticas and Babel, is auditing systems as a service, as a commercial provider. And I'd like to hear more about that also with the Asian perspective. It's one of the few organizations that performs this work outside of Europe and the US, where most of us are based. Then Jake Metcalf from another amazing organization, Data and Society, one of the spaces that has led the way in getting us all together, having spaces where we've been able to share our research, our doubts, our strategies. Unfortunately, they've closed their office in New York, which was a home for me, but the organization's still there and continue to do really great things. And Jake leads the AI on the Ground initiative, which is very relevant to what we do. And I really encourage you to check out their website, because there's really amazing science and research being done around the social impact of technologies and the challenges of AI development. Then Rami Molavi, who leads the Meaningful AI Transparency Project at Mozilla Foundation. Mozilla is another one of the organizations that has been leading the thinking around AI accountability, and with a specific focus on AI audits. And I'd love to hear about why and how Mozilla interacts and promotes this space. We also have Jat Singh from the University of Cambridge, and coming from the computer science perspective. So again, another academic contributing to the practicalities of how to make AI better. And finally, we have Michael Veal from University College London. But for me, Michael, you're the voice of policy, critical policy, because I don't know anyone who's engaged so much in EU digital policy and who has such a critical and engaged voice. So I'm super happy that you are here. Thank you all for being here. There's also other people in this team. 4 of them couldn't make it. Ruman Chowdhury will be meeting us tomorrow in Brussels. Ruman was a member of the Meta team at Twitter that got fired last week, but she's been leading the work on bias bounties and thinking about how an organization like Twitter could engage proactively with instances of bias and leading the way in showing what an organization that cares about bias and social impact looks like. Unfortunately, that's been short-lived. But it'd be great to hear from her tomorrow in Brussels. She had a last-minute thing, so she couldn't get on the plane a couple of nights ago. We're also going to be joined tomorrow by Mona Sloan from NYU, Timnit Gebru from the DARE Institute, who you may ring a bell. She was also fired from Google for her efforts around the ethics of AI. So we have a lot of people that have tried to change the system from within and haven't been very successful. And finally, Solon Barokas, who for me is a personal mentor, one of the first people that I ever heard discuss these issues together with Kathy O'Neill, and who's currently a Microsoft researcher, but continues to be someone who's very engaged in producing science and knowledge around this space. So it's an exceptional panel. I think we have everyone or most of the people who have engaged practically with the challenge of auditing algorithms. Interestingly, when we were thinking about organizing this event, we wanted to make sure that we captured the diversity of this space, and we have people from the industry, we have people from academia, and then we have people from civil society platforms as well. And I think that it just shows that algorithmic auditing has been picked up from lots of different perspectives as one of the ways that can allow us to make AI better. So maybe to start with the perspective that's less known for most people, I'd like to bring Shay and Lofred into the discussion. Like, what does it mean to provide AI auditing services? What has been your experience? Why did you get into this space? How did Babel come about? And what have you been doing around this space?
Babel came about a little bit by accident. So it was originally founded to, I'm an astrophysics professor in my day job. And so I'd originally thought I was going to be building sort of robots for NASA or something like this. And in the process of what I found out was called customer discovery, which is like go talk to people and see what the problems in the field are. As soon as I moved outside of space, I realized that there was this critical problem. This is around the time that the ProPublica came out. There was Cambridge Analytica. There was all sorts of problems with social media. And algorithmic auditing seemed like a place where I could have an impact. And so we sort of embarked on this journey of trying to figure out how do we audit a system. And the conception was, what are we looking for when we audit a system is looking for ways in which that system, and I'm using the word system here instead of like algorithm because really socio-technical, we've been talking about this, the whole system. How can the system hurt people? And how do we systematically interrogate a system such that we can figure that out? And I think we'll all agree that that's a hard job and that's something that takes a long time to figure out how to do well. And so mostly what we've been doing is trying to figure out how to do that well and coming up with methodologies. Some of them work, some of them need to be refined, and sort of building through working with clients, mostly on a voluntary basis. You know, audits as a regulatory thing has not happened until recently. And so, or at least in this space, I mean, audits have been around for a long time. And so mostly it's been working on a voluntary basis with clients who want help to identify those problems. And so we've really been cutting our teeth trying to look at these systems and figure out how do we unearth places where that system can fail for people in a systematic way, and how can we then mitigate that. And so I think we're now moving into a time when audits may be something that's required or are going to be required. And so I'm excited to get the opportunity to sort of learn from everyone else what are the challenges, because there are lots of challenges and there are so many different ways you can use AI to do great things, but also potentially hurt people. And so we need always to be critical and be humble about how we're doing and can we do better, and try to share what we've learned.
Great, thanks. The same question to you. How did TRERA come about? And if you can add some, like, what about the Asian experience? Like, is there interest in Asia for algorithmic audits? Because they don't have a regulatory requirement yet, but you are active in that space. So how did that come about as well?
Well, thanks for I don't know if this one is on. I don't think so. Maybe this one. Sorry. Well, good evening, everyone. So TRERA is an AI quality platform. So working with auditors, we're not actually doing audits. So what the platform does is it helps you explain, test, and debug AI models. It was started around 3 years ago by a professor called Anupam Datta. Anupam was a professor at Carnegie Mellon University. He's been around for 10, 15 years in Stanford before. He's one of the leading experts on explainable AI. He pioneered some of his most advanced techniques. And for those of you who are involved in academia, he was one of the co-drafters of that paper on Google Ads Google Ads algorithms being not being fair back in 2014 or 15. Just that's the background. So he started out looking at opening the black box. That's the core thing. That's how we started thinking about this AI quality. And now what we have is an AI quality end-to-end platform that helps you, and then I will come to what means quality and the link with audit here. It helps you basically making sure that around the life cycle of a model, you're able to ensure that the behavior of your model is consistent with a set of requirements. These are AI quality requirements. Where these requirements come from, there's a convergence around regulation, but also inside businesses. The AI Act has 7 requirements. You are looking at over like sectoral regulators that have specific requirements. So what we're doing is we are trying to address the translation gap between the regulatory discourse or policy discourse and the technical implications to make this happen. So now, what's the link with audits? We are partnering with audit firms by providing them AI quality software that they use for the audits, but we're also helping clients to actually improve the quality of their models. Because the challenge with audit, it's a one-time thing. It can be like, on a yearly basis, it could be a kind of regular thing, but companies want to make sure that as the model is on prediction, it is always fair, explainable, high performance, and so forth and so forth. So we are trying to make sure that that model is always, again, behaving as expected. And some auditors have asked us to provide that software as well as part of their audits. So we're empowering auditors to do their job. And we have clients in Asia, and just to close real quick on this, we're mostly in 3 industries, so financial services, tech, and retail. And so banks and insurers also in Southeast Asia, even though there is no regulation specific to AI, there are already a lot of regulation in financial services, again, around discrimination and so forth. So they're already using these capabilities, mostly for the management and risk management teams in Southeast Asia and the banks that we're working with.
Great. Jenny Shay was talking about the challenges of AI auditing. Jenny, you've been from the Other Lovelace Institute. You've released a series of reports on trying to give a bird's eye on what's happening and how the space has evolved. And the image that comes out, it's pretty messy. So, what are the challenges of making AI auditing happen at the moment?
Absolutely, thank you. I think one of the big challenges, and we've seen it at points today in our discussions so far, is that kind of when auditing entered the policy space, it entered with a surprising and thankful amount of enthusiasm, like, let's get an AI audit, that'll be great. But there are still quite a lot of questions to answer in that process of what does that look like to do it who does it? And there's often a lot of different things that people are talking about when they say the term audit. So we put out a paper back in 2020 called Examining the Black Box that looked at these terms and said that, we can, there are kind of schools of thought around auditing coming from academia, in computer and social science, coming from this idea of an audit study of testing inputs and outputs of a system to understand, for instance, things like discriminatory impacts or differential treatment. And yet, at the same time, we also have this kind of common sense term of audit, the kind of audit we've maybe all heard of in the context of financial services or something on this end, which is something that's kind of more across the board, something that we want to check that everything's okay, that everything's as it's supposed to be. And that between that, there's kind of quite a lot of space for different practices, many of these tools of which will be useful and important. But then when we're having these discussions, we kind of need to unpack, well, which one of these do we mean? And so now, as we see this kind of this new opportunity coming through with increasingly audits starting to enter legislative language. So we've particularly looked in the context of social media platforms and things like the Digital Services Act in Europe and the Online Safety Bill in the UK, which start to give regulators powers to also get involved in these activities of investigating and understanding how algorithms within social media platforms are behaving and some of their effects. And so it's starting to understand, how do we translate tools that have come from different communities of practice? How do we share knowledge between them and then apply them in processes that people can trust and use to create greater accountability?
I hear you mentioned the Data Services Act and the different new initiatives at the EU level, but if I may ask you, Jake, what is the state of play in the US? Because in the US, do you have discussions around AI auditing? Is it possible that AI audits will be part of the legislation? Have they already been mentioned in any kind of proposals? Like, how do you see the legal capturing of the possibilities of AI auditing happening in the US, and is it different from what's happening in Europe?
Yeah, it's certainly, it's different. Just in part because the governments are structured differently, right? We have these layers of federal government, state government, and local government. And so there's sort of different movements at different levels, right? What I think is clearly common across the regulatory ecosystems is this sort of move towards assessment as the core governance mechanism, right? That is, I think it's well-founded, but yet it's nonetheless an assumption that at the core of the harm that AI has done within our society is essentially that it remains ungoverned, that it remains, if you spend time inside of tech companies, which I do, you quickly learn that they often don't know what they're doing. They don't know what their systems are up to. They're built on data sets that they don't know what's in the data sets. Like you ask, does this have protected personal information in it? And they don't know. What is the demographic makeup of the test data that you built your model on, or the training data that you built your model on? They don't know, right? And so there's like some really basic governance problems around AI, where the idea is that these assessments force you to have the capacity and the habit of asking, how is the system built and what does it actually do in the world? And so I think that's what we really share across the jurisdictions, is this move towards assessment as a governance mechanism. I think where we differ, is some of the terminology, but also the way the US federal government is arranged is we tend to regulate vertically. So we'll have regulations for a sector of the economy. So we'll have regulations for financial, regulations for medical, regulations for personal data privacy. Whereas in the EU, you tend to regulate more horizontally, which is the General Data Protection Act, right? We don't tend to do those general cross-sector regulatory moves in the US, and So some sectors are already quasi-regulated around AI. Like there's already, if you're a bank, you don't get excused from all the other rules just because you throw an algorithm at it. So sometimes that's an advantage, sometimes it's a limiting factor.
And a sub-question, in the US I sense there's a big obsession with algorithms in the hiring sector. Is there a reason for that? Is because historically it's a highly protected space? Because in Europe it's one of many areas where we're concerned, but not the area. And in the US it seems to be very much the area.
I think that's in part because, part of it is just simply because New York City passed the law, right? Sort of the first law on the scene. And so now that's the problem that everyone's trying to solve, right? It's like the first point in. But also hiring and career paths and education paths in the US are a vector along which many kinds of discrimination occurs, right? So racial discrimination, gender discrimination, class discrimination, access to economic growth has been limited along a lot of different social demographic vectors. And so to the extent that algorithmic systems almost inherently replicate the current state of the world, they seem necessarily conservative or even reactionary in a way that is like an open effort to blunt our progressive hopes about how things get better, right?
That's super interesting. Thanks. You were talking about assessments being discussed in the US context. We've had assessments like data protection impact assessments in Europe for a long time. They were mentioned in GDPR. So Michael, we've been talking about assessments for a long time, but not just talking, we've regulated assessments for a long time. But we haven't been able to fix AI in practice. Even we have the most advanced data protection laws in the world are in Europe, but our systems don't seem to be significantly better than those used elsewhere in the world. What has gone wrong? What are the challenges that we have in Europe, and are they being addressed by the new digital package and all the new laws that are going to be approved in the next few weeks and months?
Thanks. So I think there's a few things going on. Impact assessments have a long history, and in the digital space, as you say, they mostly came in the GDPR, so much more recently in data protection impact assessments. And there's different views on how wide these should be. Some people say they should and do, in fact, kind of incorporate all rights and obligations, and they could be a document or a vector for doing that. There's a challenge, though, that data protection authorities are not only poor at enforcing, but they're quite poor, I think, at distinguishing what would be an okay data protection impact assessment and what wouldn't be, perhaps because there aren't good standards of assessment in this space that are very clear. They don't want to get involved in prolonged litigation. They don't want to base it. If you put yourself in the shoes of a regulator and you see that an organization has done something with an algorithmic system that's pretty illegal, you could say, well, we could try and get you on not having done a data protection impact assessment, or we can try and get you on other aspects of fairness or data breaches or other things that you may have done wrong instead. There's going to be a tendency to do the latter because it's a bit clearer to deal with than have you done the assessment right. If you made a good effort, but it maybe wasn't far enough and it didn't kind of go into a thorough way, then it's going to be, you need a very brave regulator, I think, to take that approach. So standards are one thing. And moving to the new digital package, there are many different kinds of assessments with many different actors. The challenge is the Commission has tried to regulate many different areas at once in its proposals. And then Council and Parliament have kind of gone in and added small bits, but the foundations are still there. And they call for assessment of varying things, recommender systems, AI systems as products, and systems that have AI as products inside them, for example. You've also got proposed regulation of the Platform Work Directive, very similar to the Spanish rules around platform work, about algorithmic systems at work there and assessment of these. So there's lots of standards here. That gives a lot of ways in. But it doesn't really solve the capacity problem, doesn't really solve the enforcement problem. So maybe there is a need for stronger and clearer methods and approaches to upskill and up some capacity.
Do you think that after the passing of all the new laws that are currently being discussed, we will be effectively protected in Europe from algorithmic discrimination and data privacy infringements? Are we creating the right mechanisms for that?
I think there's kind of preemptive protection. Things will still go wrong, but I think we have a pretty high level of protection in general. Like, you don't see like the same level of like ridiculous algorithmic scandals as other parts of the world. You know, there are sometimes like some here and there, and they sometimes seem to be illegal and they can be dealt with. And of course, like, it's not really a law unless you can break it. Like, it wouldn't be, that's not a law at all. And so there will be organizations that break the law, but we have ultimately like remedies and deterrents. I think the biggest challenge with all of these is there is an assumption behind many of these laws that the effort and bureaucracy and design needs and all those will fade away once we get good parts in the ecosystem, like Lego blocks. If we get good Lego blocks, then people will make good Lego houses. But the problem with a lot of digital technologies is counterintuitively that doesn't really work. Just because you've got lots of good parts doesn't mean they make a good whole. And that was the assumption behind the GDPR. Oh, it'll be cheap to enforce, it'll be cheap to deploy, because once we get a market of like trusted data components and things, they'll be able to be put together quite evenly. That's not happening, and so assessment actually does take time and effort, and you have to do it, and you have people, and they have to be creative, and they have to engage with voices they've never talked about before. And so that's a bit shocking. That is a big capacity change, and some people might write it as saying, well, that's going to cost a lot of money. And yeah, to be protected in advance, you do need to be creative about understanding the harms. Not sure how that's going to go.
Right. And thinking about like the specific history of implementation in the public sector, I want to turn to you, Divesh, because one of the things that I've been very surprised in our work at Eticas is that in all our studies, we've consistently found that the public sector is less compliant than the private sector with GDPR, but also with algorithmic transparency. We have a lot more problems to require public administration to be open about the systems that they use on the population, even though they have greater obligations in that respect. But they've been a lot more resilient and against opening up their AI systems. So you've worked a lot with the public sector. What is the reality? Why is this happening? And is there any hope for the public sector being compliant and incorporating algorithmic audits or some measure of transparency and accountability and explainability in the AI systems that they deploy and implement?
Well, I certainly hope so, since a lot of my work has been around that. But yeah, so I did a report, I worked on a report last year with Jenny, in fact, which studied mechanisms to structure accountability in the public sector in their implementations of algorithmic systems. And I think it's quite similar in terms of what challenges arise more broadly, including with the private sector. In terms of, I think there's a well-meaning effort to go about securing accountability and transparency in these systems. In many cases, it's not simply kind of fraudulent behavior in order to avoid regulation or to avoid accountability. But there's several kinds of issues that came about as impediments to creating structural accountability in these systems. And I wanted to point out maybe 3 of the ones that that I think are important in both public and private sector contexts, including ones that kind of also came up in our earlier discussions. And so I think the first is definitional ambiguity and kind of problem definition, right? Which is both about what do these regulatory mechanisms imply, right? What part of the large regulatory puzzle do audits or impact assessments fit into? But more specifically also, what are you studying, what is the object of this regulation here, and what part of it do you want to study from an accountability perspective, right? Is it simply the technical system of the algorithm, and therefore can you do bias testing on the database, for example? Or are you interested in, as you mentioned, more, the social impacts of such a system, or so the socio-technical impacts, which changes what the scope or what this regulatory tool might look like. And that's been something that the public sector has found very difficult to figure out. How broad should an audit be? How narrow should we define this particular problem? A second is the lack of incentives for compliance. And we've seen this both because we currently have very little actual regulation around the world, I think, which specifically targets the use of algorithmic systems. Right? You might have general principles for regulation in the financial sector or health sector, but the translation work that it takes to implement those accountability structures in the implementation of technologies is missing. There's a lot of different voices trying to speak to kind of patch up that area. So you might see, for example, the privacy lead at a public sector institution trying to take the reins of algorithmic accountability work, or the IT lead who has really very little kind of background or experience. And more importantly, they don't have adequate incentives, either reputational incentives or legal incentives, to actually go about doing that work and not make it simply a checkmark exercise to simply get something done, to get some papers pushed out. So it's important to think about kind of how these incentives might be structured in designing an audit system, whether it's first party, third party, however. And the third, and I think this is particularly important, is a broader kind of impediment in the lack of access and the amount of transparency that's generated in the whole ecosystem through which these systems are implemented. And it's quite scary to me that in the public sector, agencies who ought to be duly empowered by various kinds of regulations to actually inspect the kinds of technologies they're procuring aren't able to do so. And this is because of a broader kind of political economy through which these supply chains are created, right? You're not able, because of intellectual property rights, to actually secure the information that you need to properly understand and view these systems. There's also a lack of standardization in terms of how algorithmic systems are documented across the supply chain. So in many cases, the documentation simply doesn't exist for people in the public sector to be able to understand what's going on, or it isn't transferred, right? Or there's too much documentation and no one can make sense of it. And so all of these problems exist, and they're all impediments to transparency. I think it's not simply the fact of kind of opening up a source code for public viewing, but it's about kind of creating models of information that different actors can act upon. And the kinds of information that the public sector needs to act upon simply wasn't there, or wasn't given to them because of all these structural impediments. And so, yeah, I think there are other kind of difficulties, but I think these three particularly are also relevant to keep in mind when we're designing and thinking about audits and impact assessments. Procurement
is a word that came up quite a lot this morning in our discussions, and the need to fix procurement if we want better technologies, and also audits that mean something. And that's also linked to something that you also said about documentation. How one of the things that often doesn't happen in technology development is that people don't document why things are done. And so when you need to audit a system, you don't know why decisions were taken. So it's very difficult to assess a system that no one wrote about, because all you have is the data or the model that was the result of lots of conversations over a lot of time, but all you see is the model. You have no access to how that came about, and so that makes our work very, very difficult. But it was very interesting earlier talking to Jennifer, because you were saying there's also risks linked to documenting. So if we manage to get AI audits standardized and for them to become an industry must-have and something that is legally required, that would mean that companies are going to have to keep a lot more information potentially about us, so there may be privacy risks about this increase in documentation. So what are the risks of auditing?
Yeah, I mean, it's not just sort of documentation, it's also the kind of technical logs you might need to keep, the kind of records you might need to keep of the organizational processes that are going on around the technical system. All of this is information that might be either personal data relating to people, whether it's people working within the organizations that you want to try to audit, or whether it's people who are having decisions made about them using these systems or are in some way affected by these systems, there's a good chance that at least some of that will be personal data. There's a chance that some of the information you're going to be recording or logging is kind of commercially sensitive information, which is going to carry risks of storage and of giving it out to people for auditing purposes. But there are also going to be risks with if you have to build a kind of record-keeping like apparatus around this stuff, or implement technical record logging kind of mechanisms within this stuff. That those kind of mechanisms could be repurposed for forms of things like employee surveillance or employee monitoring, or for surveillance of the people who are being affected by systems. So, for example, if you ask, like, a social media platform to keep records about its content moderation decisions, then potentially that same apparatus could be used to find out about the people who are posting, objectionable content in some way, which, if it's a state coming asking for that information, there might be a good legal basis for that, but otherwise there might not be. And that's quite a concerning issue as well, I think. And we also, I think, have to be aware that if you begin to implement these kind of mechanisms, then you will kind of change what's happening within the organization as well. So if you want to implement technical logging mechanisms, then you're changing the technical system. If you want to implement sort of organizational record-keeping mechanisms around the technical system, then you're going to be changing how people are acting within that organization. Now, of course, to a large extent, that's kind of what you want to do with this, but you also run the risk of kind of getting people to act in a more sort of performative way towards this kind of thing, where they're kind of undermining the kind of auditing kind of mechanism, or kind of evading the kind of record keeping, but doing so in a way that is kind of undetectable to you from the outside, or from a kind of like sort of other perspective. So although we have to be careful about making sure that we get the right kind of information so that we can audit these systems and audit these processes, we also have to be careful about the potential implications of these things. So we need to put in place requirements around logging and record keeping, but also around what you do with the mechanisms that allow you to keep those logs and make those records, and what you do with that data once you have it.
That's really interesting, because one of the things that an idea that we've sometimes played with some of our clients is that what if you collected specific kinds of data, or you kept specific kinds of data, but only for auditing purposes, and we would keep that data. So we have that information in order to test the system, but we would make sure that you don't have access to it, so it cannot be used to train the system. So we probably will need to come up with lots of new creative ways of managing this new information that needs to be created just to ensure that systems work well. But definitely there's new challenges that will emerge with this ideal scenario of audits being mandatory and done across the board. But I wanted to go more into the accountability mechanisms, because you worked a lot on that, Jad. So what are the things that you've also found on the ground? What are those really existing accountability mechanisms, and what are the pros and cons, or like the success stories, or the non-success stories, the failure stories around trying to make systems more accountable?
Yeah, I think what's interesting, and just following on from what Jennifer said, is that how the records will be contextual, capture the right information so you can do that scrutiny, but also that might have effects. It's the same for any sorts of interventions you might put in place, be it to try and manage things, put in your guardrails, or just to be even to test your own systems to make sure the right sorts of things are happening. So really it's kind of like, a lot of these interventions with a more technical hat on in a developer system building perspective will be, one size won't fit all. You have to think very carefully about the scenarios in which you're working on things. One example, we were looking at a range of open source fairness toolkits. So these are essentially software products which you can go out there and bring, and when you're building a model, you can test it against various, where you can basically plug your model in, and these toolkits will kind of tell you whether your model's fair or not, right? So what could possibly go wrong with those sorts of things? So we did a bunch of things like comparing these toolkits, but also interviewing a whole range of developers from all different sizes of organizations, from multinationals to small business SMEs, as well as also watch them use these toolkits as well to try and observe what they were doing with things. And you can imagine none of the sort of findings are really surprising, but a lot of these things weren't fit for purpose. People weren't understanding them. These are technical experts, right? The business processes around it would be like, okay, we need to deal with this issue. We don't know what's going on in our organization, as Jake was saying before. So let's try and find out some stuff. So we'll just choose the first toolkit we can find, Each one of these is built by a different organisation, which has a different conceptualisation of fairness. They have different metrics, even if assuming all the problems with trying to metricise this sort of stuff in the first place aside. Each one would have a different way of implementing these sorts of things. So it's kind of a very interesting example to just really highlight that, you need to think about what you're actually doing in a particular context with a degree of understanding about this. And really what we use that work to show is that you can't just kind of do this sort of stuff in isolation. It's to push back on all the kind of reductionist views of these sorts of things, to say you need to consider the workflow and the processes around it. So I think that's kind of an area that I think generally the community is moving away from, but we still have a lot of sort of general learnings as the whole ecosystem sort of gains understanding there to make improvements. But I think what's also interesting is as we look how systems are being developed going forward. So the earlier algorithmic accountability auditing sort of discussions tended to kind of assume that you had an organisation that would do everything themselves, right? They would get the data, they would do the model building, they'd do the testing, they'd engineer it, they'd deploy it, they'd run it out there. And so then when you want to go challenge them, you just go to the organisation and say, hey, you're doing all this sort of stuff and deal with it. Which might be true for some big tech firms, but it's probably not true for the vast majority of how these sorts of things are being deployed. And going forward, we're going to see increasingly like an organisation is going to rely on other organisations to help deliver these sorts of things. So we're going to need to look at more interesting auditing mechanisms or mechanisms to try and gain understanding of how we're kind of, or organisations building these systems are interacting with others. And it goes back to procurement points we were talking about before. In terms of a mechanism, there was an interesting example in Australia where a local state government had a welfare system. They had a third-party company doing that on their behalf. Someone came to challenge them, as they could do under administrative law and procedures. They go into the organisation and say, hey, can we explain why this welfare decision didn't work? They said, oh no, the standard IP, it's our secret sort of stuff. So then New South Wales government said, okay, well from now on, whenever procuring a contract, we have put a provision in that, any part of the tender process, you must give us that information as part of that. So there's lots of ways that, fairly simple sorts of things we can build in to try and gain more understanding and knowledge about things. But yeah, many different approaches that can be taken.
It's incredible that like in 2022, we still have governments procuring technology and not covering their backs in terms of access to the system, because at the end of the day, they have the responsibility. If anything goes wrong, you can't say, oh, the vendor lied to me. It's like, yeah, whatever, you were the one driving the car. You were the one who got into the accident, so to speak. But we still find, and that's certainly our experience, that especially the public sector, but also the private sector, large corporations are incorporating lots of technology without doing due process and without protecting their own organizations from the liability of really problematic and faulty systems.
And so we're seeing lots of interventions that some might be kind of simple and obvious, right through to really complex sort of analyses, tools, and everything in between. So it's kind of a rich space, and it's interesting to see how these bits and pieces will fit together.
Definitely, and I wanted to finish this first round asking Rami about Mozilla. And what is the role of Mozilla in this? Because Mozilla is leading one of the very few global initiatives on AI auditing. You lead the meaningful AI transparency. And I think it's interesting that you call it meaningful, as if transparency was not enough. And it kind of points to the possibility of transparency not being meaningful. So it seems like a lot of things have gone wrong for us to have to look at auditing, meaningful transparency, accountability, explainability, and kind of fixing lots of years of very problematic software design. So what are you trying to get with these efforts around fixing all those wrongs that have been cumulative over the years?
Yes, thank you. We have learned so much about the harms in the last years, and we wanted to go from criticizing to solutions. So we, like the work on AI transparency is embedded in the overall trustworthy AI work of Mozilla. And when we started the project, we wanted to kind of offer a playbook for developers on how to use explainability tools and come up with the best practices and top 10 of the tools. And we found out that there is a huge gap between the research in the last 5 years, concentrating on XAI and all the tools, the post hoc tools to understand the reasoning of AI and the reality. And there is lots of trying out tools, but there is no widespread implementation. And also transparency to us is more than algorithmic transparency, the reasoning of AI, but we have a more wider view. And also transparency is not a goal. It's only a means to an end. It's only a precondition for human agency, for privacy, for environmental and societal well-being. It's a precondition for robustness and accuracy of the system. So it's not the goal. And also we learned from GDPR that too much information is also not useful. We know that few people read the privacy policies. So we didn't want to come up with the recommendation that people should just throw information to people, because we know and we found out in our research that there are totally different transparency needs. There are different stakeholders, like the regulators want to enforce the law, they need information around the compliance. Then the impacted people want to contest, they want to challenge the decision, they want to know how they can get a different decision. Then again, the client who is a domain expert, he wants to know how he can build the decision towards his own knowledge and see if he can trust the prognosis from a system. So you have all this, and also NGOs, of course, and journalists and watchdogs, they want to know about the harms, they want to kind of have different information. So for all these different stakeholders, we need different kinds of transparency in different depth and also in a different form of delivery. And we learned a lot about the motivations of builders, because we thought, let's not wait for the policy making and the AI Act and etc., but let's talk to the developers and data scientists, because we think that they are really important in the whole discussion. And so let's learn from them how they see it. And we only talk to those who self-identified as people working on AI transparency. So this was what they said is their kind of part of their work. And we found out that they don't have a really intrinsic motivation. So they want to find out around accuracy, and that's it, basically. They want to have a product that works for the client. And besides this, around like sustainability or accountability or even disclosing information for impacted people, there was nothing that they did provide. And so we came to, and we saw the importance of auditing, because we need proxies to kind of also translate the information. And people are sometimes not interested in the details. They want to see if it's working or not, if they are impacted or not. And this is why we see the rising importance of AI auditing. And we have a lot of work from our senior fellows, Deborah Raji and Adeba, around this. And we are going to have this as a focus area in the coming year even, because this is where we see really big impact.
Before I open the floor to questions, this morning we came up with something that we're still going to have to debate a lot. But one of the key ideas of this morning was the idea of socio-technical. I think we all agreed that what needs to be at the heart of algorithmic audits is the idea that technical systems, when they're based on personal data, they're not just technical, they are socio-technical, because the data comes from social processes. And so we kind of, the hypothesis we're going to be working on in the next few days and weeks to be proactive in putting solutions on the table is this idea that we need, on the one hand, to have an agreed methodology for a socio-technical audit that is an end-to-end inquiry into how a system works, from the moment that you choose the data that is going to be training your system up until the moment that the algorithmic decision is handled by a human being, and the problems with that phase of the human in the loop. So can we agree, or can we propose to the community and policymakers a method that allows for us to inspect AI systems from this socio-technical perspective and end-to-end. Then we also thought we need another mechanism that allows us to check that compliance has happened. And so in the first instance with the socio-technical exercise, you really go into a system. You may spend months working with a technical team, and it's more of an assessment than an audit. So what if we also created another moment or a tool that was just checking that you've done the things you were supposed to do? Because if we move towards a system in which AI is better, maybe we will not need lots of socio-technical audits because systems will be better from day one. And so you just need to check whether the right things have happened. And so what kind of shape and what kind of questions would we be asking in that tool? And the third tool is the adversarial audit. How can we also make sure that if people abuse or misuse the socio-technical audit and the other piece, the other tool that we don't have a name for yet, you can have audits that are performed by people outside of the system by exploiting the possibilities of the system to be reverse engineered. And so through adversarial approaches, you could expose when audits have been used as a tick box exercise or as a not meaningful inspection exercise. So these are some of the ideas that we're going to be working on in the coming weeks. But I wanted to do a final round with you and ask you to mention what is the main attribute that you think came out of the discussion this morning, or that is in your head as the thing that we need to make sure we put at the heart of this discussion. For me, it's socio-technical, and it's okay to repeat it, but just kind of a summary of what are the takeaways for you from this morning and your thinking around algorithmic audits. What is the main attribute of an algorithmic audit that we need to make sure we put at the heart of the systems we design? And we can maybe ask with you, Michael, and go this way.
I think a lot of people want audits to do many different things, and that's okay. We already illustrated, I think, the breadth of our concerns that we want to address around algorithmic systems. I think there's a difference between audits that try in an open-ended way to understand and map concerns that we might not even know exist, unexpected failure modes. We see this, a lot of high-risk engineering systems have always had this challenge, like what really could go wrong not just from systems built with personal data, but systems that operate in a social context, which I think is, again, as Gemma said, the sort of socio-technical, I think goes beyond just personal data even. Mm-hmm. So there's that mapping exercise, and that mapping exercise can come with a mitigation element at the end, right? Do we want to call this an audit? Because it's not clear what we're auditing against, right? There may also then be some systems where we have a fairly clear, societally agreed idea of the kind of things we want to do or not. That might be because they happen in sectors where we experience the same kinds of challenges, or they happen in contexts where we have certain expectations, or they happen in societies which have particularly cross-cutting social problems that need to be addressed, some specific kinds of discrimination, for example. And there we might have an audit against a certain standard. Now, how to combine these becomes quite difficult because it's unclear when you stop. You can keep going, you can keep opening up the question, you close down, but that kind of auditor can never say this passes the test, right? Because they also write the standard as they go. And that's an important exercise, and I think we have to figure out which actors do which of these social functions, because with complex systems, we probably will find they're all necessary to some extent.
Yeah, so I think somewhat following on from Michael's point was to just think about how these sorts of things are composed. I think that that's really important. What are the organizations involved? What are the technologies involved? How do these kind of interactions happen across boundaries? We talked a lot about supply chain, and I think that's super important going forward because it's not just one organization doing its own thing. It's a whole range of different organizations, and when they come together, that's where things get really challenging, and that's where we need more information and scrutiny and the ability to understand even in the first instance. Then you can work out what to do in response. But gaining that understanding in these kind of complex environments by considering organizational and technical compositions. I keep trying to do that.
I think that it was also very interesting to hear the different perspectives on auditing, but I think that we can come up with a bunch of principles or requirements for an audit. One of those I can remember was that we all agreed that the outcome of the audit should somehow be published. And I think that external audits would be more effective than internal audits. Also, I think that we should really build on the work that is already done in other industries, engineering industry, tech assessments from the 70s, with the scenario buildings and all the methods there. Also from the health area, so there's a lot that is already done that we can use and adapt to the needs, and I think it's a great way forward to kind of find a minimum viable set of features for auditing.
I think a critically important and often overlooked goal of auditing and assessment is to give harmed parties or impacted communities, or whatever you want to call it, an opportunity to contest how the system was built and what the system does. If the point of doing the assessment is to reduce the harm, then the way the assessment is structured needs to provide a foothold for the impacted parties to demand a change. And I think it would be a tragic mistake if we took all of this energy that we have around assessing and auditing algorithmic systems and allowed it to evolve into a position where we're essentially just saying, oh yeah, this machine does what the label says it does, right? Like that's one form of auditing that we could have. It's just, this machine does what the label says it does, right? And not inspect, well, is that good for people? Does it actually further the things that we want? Because this is a moment where we need to be asserting the right to democratically control these systems, right? Like this is AI is for people to have better lives. It's not for corporations to limit our futures. And so auditing and assessment needs to be bent on that path towards more democratic control.
I think the time has come to build the AI quality ecosystem. Again, I'm using the term quality because if you look at the AI Act, that's the term being used, and ultimately one could frame discussion in that way, saying that a system that fails on audit ultimately is a poor quality system. And you think in terms of ecosystem, now the question is, what are the different components? We know we need regulators that define what is quality. We know we need standard organization that define what are, again, the standard against which you're going to assess quality. We need companies providing software capabilities to empower the auditors. And companies need to have the ability to continuously improve the quality of their models internally. It involves processes, it involves trained people, lines of accountability, who's responsible for what. And that architecture is often is not really well thought at the moment, but I think that momentum is there with the AI Act coming and other regulations, and we should be thinking about, again, animating that ecosystem so that the only AI systems being put out there are of high quality that is literally consistent with a set of requirements that we democratically agreed upon for our representatives.
Thank you. I think my takeaway was that as we're building, regulatory systems to kind of account for the harms that we've seen in all of these AI technologies, that we don't go too far down the line of self-regulation, co-regulation, or implement mechanisms like audits, which are basically, they're ways of making these technologies more acceptable in the eyes of the law and the eyes of the public, and they need to be ways that are actually meaningfully transparent, and following on from Jake, actually allow accepted committees of historically also been kind of excluded from development processes, but also from the process of kind of even thinking about who are these technologies for and who are they going to harm, ways for them to kind of get accounted for, right? We've seen failures of audit systems in other sectors, and I think we should be learning from kind of the history of both technology regulation, but more broader kind of forms of regulation, including environmental regulation, amongst others, to see how we can build this better, right? This is a good, I think Europe particularly is an interesting space, and a time where this opportunity has arisen. And yeah, I just think it should be done right.
I think we need to be thinking about also, not just what can auditing achieve, but what can't auditing achieve. We can't expect systems or better auditing mechanisms to solve all of the problems that we have with algorithmic systems. We have to kind of recognize, I think, that even the best intentioned and best carried out audit isn't going to be able to fix the problems with systems that are kind of inherently harmful to people or groups within society. So as well as these kind of moves towards better accountability for these systems or better auditability of these systems, or however you want to frame it, we need to be thinking about what kind of things are beyond those mechanisms and what kind of things do we, as well as say that kind of democratic control that Jake was talking about, or the kind of things that David was talking about, what kind of things do we simply say are not permitted in a democratic society because they're simply too dangerous and can't be helped through auditing, can't be helped through other mechanisms. Auditing is extremely useful, but it can't solve everything, and I think that's an important thing to understand.
Yeah, so I think, for me, it's clear. It feels clear that auditing is something that people want, and corporations want it also, because in some sense it does smooth out the process and validate their tools and allows them to do things that they'd like to do. And so those of us who are interrogating these systems, looking for harm, I think the one thing that's clear is that as soon as this becomes standardized at some point, whether it's in the EU or the US, standards bodies are already thinking about these things and coming up with standards. That process, there's a danger that interrogation stops, and that we lose the ability to really get at the harms because it just becomes standardized. And so I think it's a good moment right now for us to say, given our experience interrogating these systems, looking for how they can harm people, what are the features of that interrogation, and what kind of transparencies do we want in the reports that come from audits, let's say, that are going to facilitate that not happening, that freezing of the ability where people just say it's been audited and now we can move on. What do we have to say is like a must-have, the minimal viable product for an interrogation of a system, or a transparency statement for a system that is going to allow people to have access to their rights, auditors to have access to the ability to say, oh, actually that you didn't do that as well as you should have. And so I think now that's a critical time, because if we let people who don't do it or don't understand that come up with standards that don't get reflected on carefully enough and then it gets entrenched, I think there's a danger that we're going to have to battle after the fact to try to fix that. And now it's better to fight it now when there's less friction.
Participation, I think, is a word that's come up a lot today. And when we think about assessing auditing systems, I think there's this real question of who gets to make that assessment, who gets to make that audit, who gets involved in the kinds of questions we ask, who gets to look under the hood, and who are we creating that accountability for, that accountability to. And I think in this context, when we say algorithmic auditing, there's a real risk there that we're saying two very scary and unsexy sounding things. We've said algorithmic, scary future. We've said audit, and everyone wants to fall asleep. And I think here, and you know, as we're having these conversations and trying to unpack what this looks like in future, there's this real onus to say, how do we actually bring people in to this conversation? How do we make sure these are tools that are helping people to understand what's going on and the systems that impact them, and to challenge and push against them where that's needed? And how do we make sure that this practice that we're all thinking about and developing isn't a space that feels overly technocratic, that feels like something that's only able to be looked into by people sat in a room with kind of niche and strange expertise, like some of us may have. That's true. And so I think really thinking about how we not only continue this conversation here, but we bring more people along with us and make sure these processes, these audits are really serving the wider public that they're supposed to.
That's a fantastic attribute list, actually. It captures so well what we discussed this morning. I think it captures the possibilities of this space, and it says very clearly where we stand and why we're doing this, and why this is not about imposing another layer of void, shallow, bureaucratic control, but actually it's about changing the incentives of the tech industry to make sure that people and harms are at the center of how we understand these systems. I'd like to leave the last few minutes to the audience. If you have questions, more than happy to take them. I would only insist that they are questions more than comments, if you don't mind. If you have comments, we can stay afterwards, and I'm happy to discuss, but I would like to have this space for questions. Si alguien tiene problemas o le incomoda hablar inglés, no me importa traducirlo, y lo podéis preguntar en castellano o en catalán, y yo se lo traduzco. ¿Tenim micros, Mireia? Aquí.
Thank you. Hi, Gemma. So I do a lot of work in ISO, IEC and Sensenelec on AI standardization, and a lot of what I'm hearing here is about a lack of standards within the profession. And one thing that I notice is algorithmic auditors aren't very well represented in the rooms that are coming up with the standards around how you at least deal with AI in a regulated space within the UK and probably Europe. So I think formal international technical SDOs are one way of creating standards, but there are other ways that can involve civic society or other groups of professionals. And I wondered what the panelists, or maybe you, Gemma, thinks about the way forward for the profession in the context of standardization over the next 6 to 12 months.
We briefly discussed this, and other people may have other insights, but the idea is that standards are part of the auditing methodology. So they would help us audit against something at specific moments. What the audit gives you is the context and the specific use case for a technology, which is not something that you will never get with a standard, because the standard is the same for everyone, or for almost everyone. So the audit methodology allows you to take those standards, see them in context, and use them to audit against something. So I would, as the IEEE and the ISO start producing standards around this, that would only reinforce the methodology, because it will give us more and more things to audit against. Right now, we have to kind of make up those requirements. And kind of build them as an agreement that we have as active members in this sector. But we definitely and desperately need those standards to make the methodology more robust and less contestable from other actors. I don't know if the others. I think Michael has lots of insight into this.
I have thoughts on standards. Yeah. What we see in a very, very worrying trend right now is that legislators such as the European Commission are pushing value-laden choices around fundamental rights into SDOs. And that is a completely unacceptable situation. And I think the standards development organizations actually have a duty to push back, refuse the mandate of these standards, as they have done before, and say, you cannot pass on value-laden judgments. as anybody who's worked in standardization organizations knows, like they are a strange and arcane place. They take a huge amount of effort. They are significantly industry captured because it costs a lot to send people to make standards, and those are the organizations that have the most interest in doing it in the most part. Civil society is not present. If you think about the sectoral knowledge that you need to make value-laden decisions in areas like judicial decision support or education or so on, like, those interests are not represented. Even if we did subsidize them to be represented tomorrow, they would be on Mars. They would be in a world that they do not know how to navigate. They will be in a world that the influence in standards organizations comes with incumbency and time. So I think the step really is to say, well, what things can we standardize? There may be some procedural aspects, there may be some technical aspects that are suitable for that. It is very hazardous to ever get into a situation where you separate the political from the technical. They are very deeply entwined, and in algorithmic systems, a lot of our anxieties around algorithms represent our concerns with our social situations and our societies. We cannot pass those concerns off to SDOs to standardize a way that will result in a crisis of legitimacy also for SDOs. So it's going to blow up in their faces if they don't reject the mandates of things like the EU AI Act, which has huge standardization roles.
Any more questions, or are you going to come back to that? Oh, there's a couple of hands.
Thank you. Yep. Thank you, panelists, for the interesting talk. Just had a question, because I know socio-technical keeps coming up, and thinking about how different definitions of fairness, this has come up a lot, different definitions of principles. And then you see things like UNESCO's recommendation on the ethics of AI, this human rights language. So how are you considering not only the normative principle aspect, but also are you incorporating the fundamental rights and freedoms outlined in other European mandates or recommendations? Thanks.
I think normatively, like, we try to be as, I'm just speaking from the work that my company does, like we try to, I wouldn't say be agnostic, but we kind of focus on either harms, right, which can vary widely, or interests. And some interests are so important they might give rise to duties that we'd call those rights. But I think there's so much low-hanging fruit, to be totally honest, with these systems, that it's pretty easy to make the normative calls. And there are enough principles out there, and you could probably just take the Universal Declaration of Human Rights and just go down that list and say, does this person have freedom, is this going to impinge on their freedom of education because they can't access Zoom, or they don't want people behind them to, in their class to see their room or something like that. There are lots of different ways to approach it. I think we have enough normative principles to just take the lowest hanging fruit and do a lot of good. And that's what we're trying to do. And most of the focus that we have is on, given a normative principle and given a socio-technical system, what is a repeatable, robust way of unearthing the risk of let's say, violating that normative principle? And can we do it? And if we taught somebody else how to do it, would they unearth the same thing? The answer is, right now, I think that, I'm going to let Gemma maybe disagree with me. I feel like there's still a lot of work to be done in terms of figuring out what's a repeatable, robust way to do that. But in terms of the normative principles, I feel like there's so much more low-hanging fruit or there's so many more harder problems than that we haven't even got to nuance difference between substantive fairness versus individual fairness, or things like this, different notions of fairness.
I agree that there's a need to focus on the low-hanging fruit, and there's so much that can be done that is good enough. And I think it's very important for us as a sector to realize that good enough is still good, and not let the perfect be the enemy of the good. and try to contribute to less harms in algorithmic systems in practical ways ASAP. And then we can get discussions on how to improve that. But we need kind of a template to build on, and that's what we're trying, I feel that's what we're trying to build, like a methodology that captures all of our concerns, and then as new concerns emerge, we can incorporate them. Like the relationship between non-discrimination concerns and bias testing, that's where we've moved forward the most. But there's lots of other principles like transparency, explainability, where we haven't done that. But I think as soon as we have a shared template, we can all contribute in meaningful, practical ways to make sure that we start testing for those things in ways that we share. But we need to start somewhere, because we have the things that we have enough tools already to do good. Let's make sure that we have the ability to implement those tools that we already have.
As you have been said, we don't want auditing to be an extra layer of ethical washing on the top of procedures that are undemocratic and not protecting human rights. And while you were saying that, we should learn from experience in other sectors, could you give us, for activists, some example of other sectors? I don't know, many people have said the other sector in which this auditing, of course I know in everyday life that auditing is very often used for ethical washing. So if you can bring in some examples so that we have tools to fight back in these cases.
Sure. No, I mean, you've done some fantastic work on this. But I think two immediate examples that come and have been replicated in regulation around the world are environmental impact assessments and social impact assessments. But also there's a lot of learning from kind of organizational theory and institutionalist theory about what accounting represents as a social institution and social activity, and how it changes institutions, regulations, and kind of processes, right? And I think we can learn from kind of how have we built up accounting systems, where have they succeeded and where have they failed, and also from kind of EIAs and SIAs, which have been specifically kind of co-constructed with civil society and with affected groups. But yeah.
Yeah, I mean, my example was going to be environmental impact assessments. So my team put out a report last year called Assembling Accountability, and we go through impact assessments for multiple other sectors, so environmental, fiscal, privacy, digital privacy. Privacy and digital privacy are different, and a couple other human rights impact assessment. And we draw out what are the core components of impact assessments. I think one of the most important things to realize is that the methods of audits and assessments changes over time, and that's a good thing, right? So in the US with the Environmental Protection Act and from the late 1970s, it institutes a requirement to do an environmental impact assessment when you're proposing a major development. Through litigation, through activism, through scholarship, it's become much more rigorous over time. And that's very intentional, that the regulators didn't specify exactly these are the 12 things you must do and then it's done. But rather, they allowed the components, the necessary components of an adequate assessment to be able to evolve and improve over time according to scientific expertise and outcomes from court cases. And so in the early 2000s, I think, there's sort of the addition of environmental justice impact assessments to environmental impact assessments. And so now, if you're going to build like a trash incineration plant and place it in a neighborhood that's full of people who already have an enormous chemical burden, because there's a petrol plant down the road and there's a pesticide plant on the other side of town, and that's because it's full. It's mostly Black Americans who are there, or very poor people, and they've had an enormous historical burden. You now have to put that in the report. And that allows that community to contest that decision, right? It creates facts on the ground. There's historical environmental oppression in this area. And if you don't put that in a report and if you don't justify that decision, you're going to lose in court. Your project will get shut down. And so it creates, by like leaving open the space for these processes to evolve organically over time, according to activism, according to science, according to judicial review, it becomes possible to find more leverage points to demand that your rights get respected, to demand that impacted communities get a voice.
I think that when we say algorithmic audit, a lot of people think about financial audits, and that's like the most immediate connection that people make. I think that financial audits are relevant to an extent, and we know they're not perfect, but the world is better because we have financial audits. The incentives to do things well increase because we have financial audits. So even though they're not an immediate reference, we think that we need to rescue the good things about financial audits. But for me, lately, the space where I get the most inspiration is clinical trials. And I like the idea of the precautionary principle. Like if you want to put a piece of medicine in the world, if you want to put a vaccine in the world, you need to prove that you will not be causing more harm than good. And you need to prove that in very specific ways before independent bodies. And someone had to come up at some point, vaccines didn't come with clinical trials. Someone had to come up with them. And I think that that's our role. How do we incorporate the precautionary principle in an industry that was born and raised with this belief that you can move fast and break things, even if the things that you're breaking are people? So I'm learning a lot from the medical sector recently and seeing how and I think that the stakes are as high as in the medical industry. So for me, it's a huge reference at the moment. But I started also with environmental impact assessments. That was my first initial reference when I started working on this, was environmental impact assessments.
A quick comment to your question. We tend to focus a lot on ethic washing because we think about AI adoption in big tech, and that's perfectly fair. By far, the biggest adopters of AI. As AI is adopted in over sectors, these sectors already have regulation. It's not like financial institutions like banks have a lot of regulation. It's really hard to be just reckless and say, oh, now just this new algorithm and I'm not going to comply with any regulation. Same thing in pharma, frankly. Same thing in aerospace. Same thing in automotive. In all these industries, well, they need to figure out a way to make sure that the technology is safe, is compliant with existing regulation, and making sure that it's not harming the consumer ultimately. So I think we're going to see better use of AI in these industries. So it's very important to distinguish industries and use cases and constraints of these industries. They're not facing the same constraints. So I'm much more hopeful about the use of AI in these other industries.
I think we have time for one more question, if that's okay.
Yeah, this is a question from industry to Dr. Brown. You mentioned the difference, you mentioned systems and algorithms. And in our case, for instance, coming from the industry, what we do know is that we do applications that are actually assisting a human decision. So there is another layer, which is the human layer. Do these audits cover as well this human layer?
Yeah, that's a really good question. Depends on who you ask. If you're asking me, I think if you're asking Eticas, the answer is yes. And that's the critical thing that we don't want to miss, because most of the risk, when we do a risk assessment, or you can call it a socio-technical audit or whatever you want to call it, most of the risk that we find, even beyond things like bias, are the places where the algorithm interacts with a person. And so if you don't talk to that person and, let's say, figure out what's your understanding about what that algorithm is telling you, how are you interpreting it, how are you using it, and that's where a lot of the risk comes in. And so I say the answer is yes, but what, let's say, the European Union decides, or what different regulators in America decide, I think that's what's at stake, is whether they are acknowledging that when they make regulation. But I think it's critically important.
Yeah, I agree. It's a fundamental part of the audit. That's why we say socio-technical end-to-end audit, from the data selection and choices all the way to the actual impact on a citizen, which means that oftentimes there's a mediator who's a human being. In our experience, the human in the loop that was built in the EU legislation as a guarantee for fairness is actually an actor of unfairness. So we really need to address this. And we also, when we propose a socio-technical end-to-end audit methodology, we're also saying, and if you only focus on the technical aspects, if you forget about this interaction, you're not auditing. You're just doing like an accuracy assessment, whatever, but you're not really auditing, you're not looking at the harms, you're not looking at the context. So we want to make sure by proposing one way of doing this that we can all agree, but we're also making it harder for the bad players that just want to develop tick box exercises or technical exercises that don't actually look at real impacts. We want to make it hard for them to claim that they are algorithmic auditors. So we're also saying this is not an audit, and I think that's as important as saying this is an audit. And we discussed a lot about this morning. One more?
I'm sorry, very short question. I work in a trade union, and in Spain, as you well know and you comment, we have a very new law about to know the algorithms in the work. But you are talking all the time around transparency, also regulation, but we need a government that enforces the law, because now we are asking for the algorithms and the companies are not giving, or maybe they are changing. So this is like the third step that in Spain we are here now. I mean, I know in the other countries they are not. You are maybe in the first step of transparency and also making this law. And this is because Jen might say I'm helping the government on that. But my question is, how do you feel as a researchers and policy makers and that you help also governments in your countries? How do you feel when, for example, a big company like Apple, when they change their system, their software, to not follow the advertising, and they are doing more to that than the governments? I mean, how do you feel like the companies are protecting more the privacy of the customers than the governments? So have we trust or put the confidence more in the companies, or where we have to do the pressure, in the companies or in the governments? Because the governments maybe are always late, are running after the companies.
Everywhere. Anytime, everywhere. Yeah, there's not even or. I mean, the government and the public space, they lack of knowledge. They are totally dependent on the suppliers of knowledge, and they take it as reality. So they get an opinion, and for them it's not an opinion, it's a description. So they are in a bad situation to say that. So sometimes it's not even wanted to act like that. And also it's a political question if you want to fund enforcement or not. We have, in the privacy area, we have nearly nobody enforcing the law, like 3 people in Germany, 5 people in France. So if you come up with a law but it's not the discussion of today to come up with the discussion on symbolic legislation. So also there is a law that nobody knows, platform regulation, B2B. There are already transparency requirements in it. Why did you rank a specific service higher and come up with the criteria? Nobody enforces because they just forgot to have sanctions in the law. So, and this is also a political question.
On the last point you had about governments and companies, some would say you have to pick your poison, but I wouldn't say that. I think what you have to notice is why can companies like Apple make those choices and do that? And it's because they have consolidated power and control in such an extreme way that their policy choices are things that people have to obey, that they can make with zero legitimacy and instantly. And this is a challenge because governments also enjoy to regulate through such companies. They say, we like the fact that companies have gathered so much control because it makes the job on the internet easier for us. We just knock on the door of that company and say, here's what we want the rules to be. Can you please make sure that your app store does not contain X or Y or Z? This is not a great state of affairs. This is not something that we should promote. I think it is a hard thing to regulate digital technologies, and we have to treat it like it's a hard thing, and we have to stop taking shortcuts through these companies, and that's going to make it very difficult for governments. But it's only if we all turn this into a political thing where parties have to say, what is the internet or the digital environment we actually want? And it comes up when people want to vote for parties and their manifestos, and these governments have to really show a coherent, powerful vision that maybe differs, and people say, ah, yes, that one or that one. At the moment, the internet people want is that we want more nice stuff, less bad stuff. We don't really care how it's achieved. Just ask the companies to do it. You know, that's not a political vision. That's it's a disaster.
Just to complement on this point, I don't think that policymakers are really naive about some of these challenges. Actually, I would argue that folks at Brussels who are going to meet tomorrow knows a lot about this. One thing also I think we learned with GDPR, and one thing we need to acknowledge, it's really hard to regulate foreign actors. It comes to power dynamics. It's good to have a regulation of the laws and the funding of the regulators, but if you are trying to enforce this on actors that are based in the US, you get quickly into trade wars and trade dynamics. And the question for the EU, and I'm really happy that they try to address up front, is how do you strengthen an AI industry in Europe? How do you make sure that the leading actors that control the apps who lost the consumer-facing battle, fair enough? What about these other industries who have leaders based in the EU? We know the CEOs, we can go to them, the headquarters is based here in Europe. These people are accountable to us. The moment you have the users of the market share is completely controlled by foreign actors, you're going to get into these trade wars. So it's one thing to regulate, but make sure that you don't lose the industrial battle as well. It's really, really, really important. Otherwise, you're screwed. You can write anything you want, fund as much as you want. They will have leverage because you're fighting with other governments now.
And just to close, I'm super grateful for your question because it allows me to close on an exclusive piece of news that I can share today. But I think that the enforcement gap is something that's been very obvious with GDPR since 2016, 2017, 2018, and 2019 when we thought that things were going to begin to change, and then they didn't. The good thing is that now a lot of actors are realizing that the enforcement gap cannot be denied anymore. It needs to be addressed head on because we have a huge problem. The cost of not complying with existing laws up till now has been close to zero, and that has to change. And everyone's in agreement right now that that has to change. So that's the good thing about the current moment. And we're trying to contribute to this. I mean, we convened this meeting because in the last few months, a lot of different governments and public institutions have asked us to tell them how to audit. And we didn't want to be on our own because we think that they're opening the door to the possibility of a tool that can shape the future of technology. And if it's just us, it may end up in a drawer. But if we use that door for a whole community that has the credibility that all these people here have and their institutions behind them, we have a chance at actually them being like, okay, let's use these tools. So I think that the enforcement gap is going to begin to be addressed in more meaningful ways in the coming months and years. But I think it's an anomaly that needs to end because it translates into lack of protection and very real harms with lots of people. And the piece of news that I can give you is that the expert group of the Spanish Ministry of Labor that work on the algorithmic leaflet before the summer, the next thing that we've been asked to develop by the ministry is the guide on how to audit in the labor sector. So that's the next step into bridging this enforcement gap. With the algorithmic leaflet, we already have a tool for labor inspection, para inspección de trabajo, to know exactly what algorithmic transparency means. With a guide to auditing in the labor sector, both trade unions and the industry will know what it means to do things well, responsibly, and with a perspective that minimizes harms. So I think that we're getting there. It's very late. We've wasted a lot of time, but right now we are getting there. The thing is, how do we make sure that when we are asked to be at the table, we don't beat around the bush? That's my main fear. You know, like we have the door open and we don't know what to do with the space that we're given. I want to make sure that when we cross that door, our statements are so powerful that it kind of falls on its own weight. And I really think that with this kind of company, we can make it happen. So with that, thank you again for coming. We're going to stay around for conversations. I'm super excited about what we did this morning, about this event, about the meetings tomorrow in Brussels. This is the beginning of of a journey. We'll have more international meetings of algorithmic auditors, and hopefully by the time we have the next one, we'll have a lot more auditors and experience on the ground on how this is done and how we effectively and practically protect people in technology environments. So hope to see you in that journey, and thanks again for coming. And thank you for the whole panel, because they come from very far away. Thanks for being in Barcelona and Brussels with us. Thank you.